Now, Marine Le Pen has tried to backpedal somewhat by saying that actually the French state was in London at the time. She's referring to de Gaulle. So could you put that into context for us? Who was leading France at the time and from where?
In 1942, it was clearly the French cabinet who was in Vichy, headed by the Marshal Pétain, with the Prime Minister being Pierre Laval, who was condemned to death and shot at the liberation of France. The government at that time, the French government, was still considered as legitimate by the main power and by France. It's only in 1944 that de Gaulle and the Free France Committee, that turned into the provisory government, was considered suddenly as the legitimate government. But de Gaulle created a myth, a very powerful myth, that what happened in Vichy was not the real France. It was the anti-France, and that himself embodied the true France and the true Republic. It was a myth that was very helpful in the post-war year, but that has been shattered, had been contradicted heavily by research, by scholars, by memory since the 1960s. So it's Marine Le Pen is going back to a myth, and I don't personally believe that she believes in that. She comes from the extreme right, from the far right, and she suddenly admitted, after a campaign in which she kind of cherry-picked, themes from the left side of the French political debate and from the traditional right. And suddenly it's as if she admitted that no, she likes Vichy, she doesn't want, even she pretends to be a Gaullist.
Well, she certainly tried to distance herself from her father. As we heard in that report of Jean-Marie Le Pen, he's been charged for making anti-Semitic remarks. So why would she say this now, knowing perfectly well that it's going to be a big deal, that people
so
are
just
not
a little
respond?
sign she makes to the traditional far right, She managed to expand a potential pool of voters, promising that she will defend the welfare state, but all speeches or narratives is traditionally nationalistic and defining herself through her enemies. Hate. It's a hate speech, continuous hate speech toward Muslim and towards foreigners. She avoided being anti-Semitic. The first declaration she made when she became president of the National Front, the Front National, was to recognize the horror of the Nazi regime. In a very vague declaration, she obviously doesn't know a lot, about, death camp, Auschwitz and concentration. And she mixed everything. But that has
does she not know a lot, or does she actually know? And she's just, like you say, trying to appeal to a certain group of voters? Because, she's a well-educated, smart woman. Say what you like about her policies, but I think, you could argue that she knows what she's saying, and like you say, this is just about expanding her support base.
That's what I think, But it's also giving a little sign to the far right, she also understood that you cannot become president of France today in the 21st century if you have a clear anti-Semitic approach of politics. So she denies being an anti-Semite, but in all the narrative and speech and politics, denouncing the enemies of France, this is in the continuity of the traditional far right narrative, speech and tradition.
And that's actually how Benoît Hamon, the socialist candidate, responded. He said that clearly now there's no longer any doubt that Le Pen is from the extreme right.
There was never a doubt.
That's what I was going to say. Was there any doubt?
No.
It's not because she's, like you say, cherry-picking and using some leftist policies that she's not from the extreme right.
She convinced many people that she's not that dangerous, and she convinced them because she got rid of all the, official narrative of her father, that was, the traditional Algeria war and, all this traditional Catholicism. And suddenly, it's as if the reality of her political thinking, is coming back, It's like psychoanalytical. You want to distance yourself from the reality of who you are, and suddenly it's coming back.
What impact do you think this is going to have on the campaign?
Oh, I don't think it will have any impact.
No?
No.
That she won't? You said she was trying to say to the far right.
The declaration is too balanced, in that way. It's not blatant enough. It's not anti-Semitic enough to have really to really change the mind of many of our voters.
Now, just coming back to the actual events then, the Veldiv, as it's called here in France, you mentioned that de Gaulle said at the time that he was the real France, so France, couldn't have been France's responsibility. But Jacques Chirac, as we heard in the report in 1995, did say that France was responsible.
Yes.
François Hollande reiterated that.
And Sarkozy too, yes.
So, but why did it take so long for France to recognize its responsibility?
Because France also has a national tradition of greatness, la grande nation, and it's always very difficult in France to face the dark chapters of its past. But it's the same in most of the nations in Europe, in the United States too. It takes time. So it's only at the end of the 1960s that you had some changes in the national politics of memory. I must say that de Gaulle, of course, built up this myth, of the résistentialisme, that the true France was within the resistance and in London, but he never mentioned the Holocaust. So we want to use this Gaullist myth to kind of speak about the Holocaust, but it was not the fact. He never mentioned the Holocaust, even in his memoirs, and he was very conscious of that. So that was a politics of, setting aside this unbearable chapter of French history.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time and your analysis, Jean-Marc Dreyfus.